Okay, welcome everyone to Icon Weekly Seminar. This is another amazing talk. I think you all gonna really enjoy. This week's guest is from Penn State University, Professor Herschel Pangborn. Is an assistant professor at the Mechanical Engineering Department and has a 4TC opponent of the Aerospace Department. Professor Pangborn did his bachelor at the same university, right, at the Penn State University, and did the master's and the PhD in the our neighboring school, restaurant thing. And after that, I think he joined the faculty positions at Penn State. And during the time, Professor Pangborn received was a summer faculty fellow at the Air Force Research Laboratory, and also he received the ONR Young Investigator Award from the same agency. No, sorry, from OR. And the professor, I think Pangborn's research lies into model predictive control, optimizations, and set theory-based verification method, and has application to the thermal systems. So let's please welcome our speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to get to come here and visit, talk to a lot of colleagues and students, and share some of the work my team has been developing over the last couple of years. So we call ourselves the PAC Lab, about 10 grad students and 5 undergrads in the lab right now. Really what we do is at the intersection of modeling and optimization and control with applications, including not limited to energy systems. And we're fortunate to have sponsorship from a lot of different federal agencies as well as companies, and the work I'll be sharing in many cases was funded by some of those logos, and you'll kind of see that as we go. What I thought I would do is.
Was it okay on that thing at the top?
Oh, okay. If I can get my mouse over there. Cool, thank you. What I thought I would do first is give a quick overview of the energy systems piece of what we do. And then we'll go back to the title of the talk on safety assured verification. I clicked that and now I'm out of PowerPoint. There we go. So in energy systems, we really do modeling, optimization, and control. A lot of the modeling focuses on integrating across propulsion, power, and thermal systems for aircraft. So you think about an aircraft holistically, you have propulsion systems, you have mechanical systems, electrical systems, more and more electrical power every decade, and then you have hydraulic systems, right? And all of those have to be integrated together because their dynamics are tightly coupled to each other. So we develop modeling approaches that can capture those different systems together. Then once we understand the systems, we can exploit that knowledge for design optimization as well as controls. We often find that these systems are so complex that we can't just have a single control algorithm that makes all the decisions for all the actuators. And so that's where we have hierarchical control approaches that take networks of algorithms that are integrated together to collectively make decisions. On the modeling side, a technique we found is particularly useful is this idea of graph-based modeling. So you can think about a system like what I have there in the top left, where we have a hybrid electric aircraft, propulsion, power, and thermal management system, kind of notional architecture. And anywhere you store energy, you put a node for a graph, and anywhere you transfer energy, you put an edge. And that energy could be electrical, mechanical, thermal. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, conservation of energy applies in the same way. And then we get this nice network equation that describes how the energy is stored and transferred in the graph. That red matrix M is the incidence matrix that tells you about the structure of interconnections. And then we can, again, exploit this knowledge of both the system dynamics, but also their structure in a number of really interesting ways. We do apply control to these systems quite a lot. A lot of what we do is model predictive control. I won't talk about that too much because I think most of you understand how MPC works. So you take a dynamic model, right? It could be a linear or nonlinear model. You define a cost function, right? When the cost function is small, that means the system is performing well, whatever well means. And you define some inequality constraints on typically what safe operation looks like. And then you solve the minimization problem subject to the model and the constraints. And we use this to control energy systems. Here's an example. This data was actually taken here at Purdue. So when I was a graduate student at Illinois, there was a center here that we collaborated with, run by Tim Fisher. So I drove, the 2 hours or so over here, right? We popped an MPC controller on this test bed that was down at Zucro Labs at the time, got some really nice data that showed that MPC worked well. That's the fastest I've ever gotten a controller running on hardware. So you must all have good luck doing that here, because it has not always gone as smoothly for me in other places, but it worked nicely. So what you're seeing here is we have a heat load as a disturbance to a thermal system, and we're controlling a flow rate to cool the system off. And when you use a conventional controller, you basically wait until the system starts getting hot, and then you ramp up the pump, and by then it's too late to avoid a really severe temperature excursion beyond a limit. But if you use predictive control and you have some expectation that that load is going to come, then you can ramp up the pump in advance, pre-cool the load, and do a much better job of respecting the thermal constraint. Another thing we've been working on at Penn State is confronting the nonlinearities in these systems. So we have here a schematic of a thermal management system. We take that same graph-based model, and what we do is we preserve the structure of the graph. But where there are nonlinearities, we add an extra data-based node, and that's that node labeled as eta. And we basically train the equations for the edges going into and out of that node using data. So we take an existing conservation of energy structure, and then we lift that with additional states where there are nonlinearities. And we still preserve conservation of energy, but now we have basically a physics-informed model. And we train these additional states to be linear, and so we wind up with a linear model. So this is like an alternative to a Taylor series linearization, is this what we call a lifted linearization, because you're adding additional states, right? This is very similar to Koopman linearization methods, if you're familiar with those. And what we see is that a conventional linearization, a Taylor linearization, tends to not hold up very well over a prediction horizon of MPC, because you linearize about the initial point, and then as you get away from that operating condition, the linearization error kind of falls apart. But this lifting linearization gives you an LTI model, a global model, that holds up well over a longer period of time. And so in terms of things like temperature constraint violation, right, we'll do much better, increasingly so as the horizon increases. Whereas a Taylor linearization, as you have a longer prediction horizon, it'll do better, but then it starts to do worse again as the horizon continues increasing, basically because you're getting so much model error over long horizons. And this is a simulation result. It took us about a year to make this happen experimentally, but we did figure out how to do it, and we have a paper coming up on this that we plan to submit soon. So there's our thermal management testbed on the left, and then we basically got similar results on the experiment. This is for a slightly different size system, slightly different architecture, so it's not exactly the same bars, but the general trends hold up. We also do some system design. Actually, this is more on control first. So this is a hierarchical controller. So we have a network of predictive controllers that are, in this case, coordinating the operation of a thermal system that's coupled to a electrified propulsion system. So that system on the right basically has like a small engine, like a lawnmower engine, that's powering a generator, and then that's powering some loads, as well as a motor dyno for a propulsor. And by using predictive controls and a network of controllers that are managing different timescales and different energy domains, we're able to get some nice increases in both efficiency and performance. And then here's the design one. So for this, we modeled a hybrid electric aircraft, and then we solved a co-design problem to both choose how to do the power split between the engine and the battery, as well as how to control the flow rates for the cooling systems. And we did those control optimizations together with sizing components. So we were sizing the battery, we were sizing the heat exchangers. Obviously, bigger components help out with the power and thermal management, but they also have a mass penalty, so then it takes more energy to fly the mission plan, right? So we looked at some different configurations, basically looking at different efficiencies and energy densities for batteries, looking at trying to penalize fuel expenditure more than consuming other energy. And you can basically see how for different model assumptions and different objectives, the optimal design changes. All right, so that was a quick overview of the things I'm not going to get into further detail on with the talk. What I really wanted to focus on is this theme around set-theoretic methods for safety-assured autonomy. So we'll talk about some offline verification of closed-loop systems. Then, as dessert, we'll talk about some online motion planning and show you some cool videos of robots. So in terms of offline verification, I want to frame this in terms of reachability. So the idea of reachability is, imagine you have a dynamic system, right? Maybe it's a fixed-wing aircraft, like we have a cartoon of on the left there. And that system's going to leave from some initial set, right? Any point in that initial set. and you'd like it to get inside of some target set. And along the way, there's some unsafe set you want to stay out of, and maybe some bounded disturbances that can hit you along the way. And so the idea of reachability is to basically calculate the tube of all trajectories that the system will follow, right? And that's that gray tube that you see, right? And ideally, you'd like to be able to prove that your system is safe, meaning that you don't enter your unsafe set, no matter what the disturbances are. And you'd like to have some proof of performance that you get inside of some target set, right? Your final reachable set is inside some maybe landing zone. And you can do this by, one way to approach this, and I think this is the most common that one might use conventionally, is you just run a ton of simulations, right? You hope that if you run enough simulations that if there was anything that was going to be unsafe, you would see that in one of the simulations, and then you'd know. But of course, this is not exhaustive, right? Just because you haven't found a simulation that's unsafe doesn't mean some other one exists. And there are certainly other ways of doing sampling and stochastic approaches that might be able to provide some probabilistic guarantees, but just kind of blindly running a bunch of simulations, right, is not a way to verify safety. So instead, what we want to do is calculate sets that bound these trajectories. And so here's an example of forward reachability. So we have some nonlinear system in discrete time, right? The state update is given by a function f. It's a function of states, inputs, and disturbances, right, where the inputs and disturbances are bounded. And so this kind of maps us from a state at step k to a state at step k plus 1, right? And we can do this operation as a set. Here's a system we're propagating. So we have a system with two equilibria that split across a guard right down the center line there. So when your system crosses that guard, right, the reachable set splits off into two pieces and will converge towards one of those two equilibria. And if you can do this forward, you can do it backwards as well, right? So I can define a predecessor or precursor set, right, where now I kind of start in the set at step k plus 1, and this maps me backward in time to the set at step k. And the way you handle disturbances and inputs here is a little different, but you can kind of get the intuition behind it. You see in this case, if you start close to the equilibria and then go backwards, it turns out you can actually reach those equilibria from either side of the guard. So you get a bigger set in this case when you go backwards than when we went forwards. And so if you're going to use these set-based reachability tools, really the first question you should ask yourself is, what set representation do I want to use? Right? Do I want to represent sets with intervals, like basically, boxes? Do I want to use ellipses, some type of polytope, or other things? Right? Here I've shown in particular a VREP polytope, right? So it's a polytope. It's basically the convex hull of a set of vertices. We could use HREP polytopes equivalently. In HREP, you basically write equations for all the lines that are the edges of this polytope, and then you have an inequality that tells you which side of each of those lines the set lies on. So you think a collection of inequalities, right? And the way you choose, in my opinion, right, is you look at what you need to do with that set and what it costs you in terms of the computational complexity and also the memory complexity of storing the set. Right? So I'll just use computational complexity here for the purposes of our study. And so we can basically fill in and color code based on whether that computational complexity is polynomial, which would include linear, right? Whether it's exponential, or whether you can't do that operation at all and get the same set back, right? So for example, if I take two ellipses and I want to take their intersection, that intersection doesn't necessarily give me an ellipse back, right? So we would say that ellipsoids are not closed under the intersection operation, but polytopes would give you a polytope back as long as they have some. Well, I guess even if the intersection's empty, right? The empty set can still be a polytope, so it works out. And listed here, I have these things called zonotopes and constrained zonotopes. You may or may not have ever heard of those before, so we're going to rely on them, and I want to give you a quick 101 about what those are. So zonotopes 101. The idea of zonotopes is you take a set of factors, which are these psi variables, and the factors are basically bounded inside a unit hypercube. So think of them as like living in some box, and then you map them by a matrix G, and then shift them by a center C. All right, that's all a zonotope is. And it turns out that you can use zonotopes to represent any centrally symmetric convex polytope. So it can't be any polytope, but it can be a subset of polytopes that have a certain symmetry property to them, right? And if we go back, you see zonotopes, right? They've got greens for at least the linear map of the Minkowski sum, but you can't do intersections with them because they're not general enough, right? You could take an intersection and you could get a set that doesn't have that symmetry property, which you couldn't represent as a zonotope. So fortunately, in 2016, some really smart folks figured out how to fix that, and they added an extra equality constraint onto the factor space, right? So that's this extra thing that's now in there, right? And that constrains the set of factors. So now instead of lying anywhere in the hypercube, right, they might just be some subset. In this case, we kind of get a plane inside that hypercube, right? And then you do the mapping by G and the shifting by the center, and now you can represent any polytope as a constrained zonotope. And again, you get lots of greens, right, in terms of your computational complexity. You can't take unions because the union could give you a non-convex set, right? And these still have to be convex. So let's go back to that example of our system with two equilibria, right? So now we've explicitly written out the equation for it, right? I'll follow one of two dynamic systems depending on what side of the guard I'm in. And if you propagate the system forward, you reach a point where you cross the guard, right? And now one half of this set is going to follow one set of equations, and the other is going to follow the other set of equations. And it turns out they're going to split apart into a non-convex set, a disjoint non-convex set. So what do you do? Well, one thing you can do is you can just basically split it into two pieces and propagate each piece separately, right? So now we have two sets to keep track of, and we propagate both of them. But unfortunately, both of them cross the guard to the next step. So, okay, we'll split them again. Now we have four to keep track of, right? And we'll propagate them again. And you can kind of see the problem, right? That the number of sets I have to keep track of grows exponentially. So I have to store all those in memory. And I also have to propagate all of them through the dynamics every step. So it starts to affect both my memory and my computational complexity. So what can we do? Well, we can add one more thing to this constrained zonotope representation, right? And this paper, I should point out, was led by Trevor Bird, who is a PhD student at Purdue, advised by Neera Jain, who's on the faculty here. So, this comes from this school in collaboration with myself and some other folks. So what we did is we added to this factor space not only these continuous factors that are inside the unit hypercube, but also a set of binary factors, which are the one you see with the superscript B on them, right? So now I have binary variables inside my set representation, and I can use those to represent essentially collections of polytopes all inside a single representation, right? So you can see in this case, our factors wind up actually being disjoint. And then when you map those through, you get two polytopes for this example. And it turns out that if I introduce NB of these binary factors, I can represent the union of 2 to the NB convex sets inside a hybrid zonotope. So we're embedding an exponential number of convex sets inside a representation that has just a linear number of binary variables. And I'll skip a couple of you. And, right, you get greens all the way across. So all those really nice, efficient set operations that we got with zonotopes and constrained zonotopes, you still get with hybrid zonotopes, right? And now you can take unions because it doesn't matter that they're not convex. So here's a couple examples for you. For a while, my grad students were really into chess. So they spent a lot of time trying to find the best way to represent a chessboard as a hybrid zonotope, right? And you can do it with 5 binary generators, right? So this description of matrices on the left, right? That's what you need to basically represent just these brown squares on the chessboard, right? So 32 convex sets all bundled within one hybrid zonotope. Here's a more complex example. This is basically just a random hybrid zonotope that has 20 binary factors. So this could represent 2 to the 20 potential convex sets. But it turns out a lot of them wind up mapping to empty sets. And so there's actually only a little more than 1,000 that are non-empty, right? And we spent a lot of time trying to understand even just how to plot these. But we've gotten it down to we can plot something like this in about a minute, right? And that requires solving some mixed integer programs to evaluate, which combinations of binary factors are empty or non-empty. So these sets propagate really fast, I can do all these operations implicitly, right? Basically build up all the matrices that describe a hybrid zonotope. But then if we want to analyze that hybrid zonotope, we're analyzing a mixed integer description, and that's going to require some mixed integer optimization most of the time. So hybrid zonotopes we found to be a really expressive set representation. We can use them for all kinds of purposes in the context of control systems. So I'm going to go through 4 real quick, and they're basically these. So representing mixed integer dynamical or piecewise affine systems, representing reachable sets of MPC and closed loop, some stuff with neural networks, and then more general nonlinear systems. And I guess shameless plug, if you're interested in this, we did write a MATLAB toolbox called ZonoLab. There's a paper that was an ACC tied to this, and so you can check out ZonoLab, and you can download it off GitHub and run these examples in your computer and play with them. Every time I talk about this, someone asks me when we're going to release a Python version, right? Understandably, there are some other Python tools for constrained zonotopes and hybrid zonotopes, but we are working on one of our own, actually implementing some things in C++ and then Python binding, so it'll wind up being really fast. I'll show you towards the end of the talk some things we're doing for using these sets for real-time control of robots in ROS. So we are going to release some tools on that soon. I'm hoping maybe within the next month or so. All right, so how do we do all these things? Well, the key that we found is really useful is to think about building hybrid zonotopes as mappings of dynamic systems. So for example, right, we could take a particular system, right, and we define this set that basically stacks states at step k on top of states at step k plus 1, right, where the ones at k plus 1 are the successor set of some system, right, potentially with some controller in the loop, right, and that's valid within some domain, right? So through its dimensions, right, this set would basically map you from one step of a system to the next. And this could be an open loop system, closed loop, right? I'm showing a kind of a closed loop formulation here, but that's not required. And what's nice is once you have that set, you can use these really efficient set operations to actually perform the reachability analysis. So I can take some initial set of interest at step k, I do a generalized intersection with my map, and then a linear mapping onto the dimensions at step k plus 1, and I can see where that set will go at the next time step, right? And these operations actually scale linearly with the dimension of the system, and as you go, you build up more memory complexity in the set, but that scales linearly as well. And we can do some order reduction along the way if we want to try to combat that. What I'll show you is towards in a couple slides is how we can handle higher dimensional systems by doing some clever things with functional decomposition as well, right? So that helps to support scalability. So here's an example to make this a little more concrete. So let's say we take our set-based mapping to be a neural network. Neural networks are, if they have ReLU activation functions, they're just piecewise linear systems. We can represent those exactly with hybrid zonotopes. And so here we have a ReLU neural network. We have kind of 2 input dimensions, x1 and x2, and then this outputs to our y hat. So what I do is I take some initial set, which is the smaller kind of purple set you see on the left, right? I take a generalized intersection of that with my map, and then I take a linear mapping onto the output dimension, and it'll tell me what are all the outputs that I could reach from those initial values for x1 and x2. And we can do this going backwards just as easily as forward, right? I just reverse the order of the operation. So for example, I could say, maybe I care about which inputs I could reach positive outputs from. So I just take all of the positive outputs in this map, right? And then I go backwards and it'll tell me what are the initial values of x1 and x2. What's the set of x1 and x2 that would give me a positive value out of the network, right? And you can see how non-convex these are, but we can capture them all with just a single hybrid zonotope. So to show you some example systems, here we have a logical system. So we have basically a schematic of like a building from above. We're going to model the thermodynamics of this building. So their rooms are exchanging heat with each other as well as with the environment. And then 2 of the rooms have thermostats that cause heaters to turn on and off. And we're going to model this system as a discrete time system. So the plan itself here we're treating to be discrete. And we apply reachability to this. Because the system has 6 states for the 6 temperatures, we can't plot those all at once. So we can kind of plot cross sections of them, which is what I'm doing here on the right. And what you see is you start in the kind of lightest blue set, and then we run this forward, I think 100 steps. And you can see how when we hit the thermostat thresholds, different parts of the set cause that thermostat to trigger at different times. And so it fractures into all these tiny pieces. So if we propagate this without any order reduction techniques and hybrid zonotopes, it takes less than a second. If we do some order reduction along the way, it takes a little more than 10 seconds. Approaches in the literature that would basically do this splitting of sets and try to just track as a collection of convex sets, right? That takes more than 100 seconds, right? And it's not only the computation time, but it's also how much memory you have to use, right? So you look at our proposed method, you have to store, a couple hundred variables in there, but if you propagate as a bunch of convex sets, you're storing tens of thousands of generators and constraints. And just to prove that this is a reachable set, you can simulate individual trajectories, which are all these green points. And you can see that they're all contained by the reachable set. And you also see that they tend to not capture the most extremal temperatures, which is why you have to be careful about something like Monte Carlo methods, right? Because they will tend to calculate to give you like the interior of the set, but they don't tend to capture the more extremal points, which are maybe the ones you care about the most if you're trying to guarantee safety. You can also go backwards again. So here we picked some final temperature, and then we went, I think, 50 steps backwards in time from that. And our method took a third of a second, and other approaches take 600 times longer, and again, require storing a lot more variables in memory as well. So that's a logical system, right, that has linear dynamics and then some kind of switching logic behind it. We can also do reachability of MPC. This is also work that was led by Trevor Bird here at Purdue. And so basically the idea is you take an MPC formulation with a quadratic cost and linear model. It turns out that if you write out the explicit solution to that, it gives you piecewise linear control laws. And so what we did is we basically took the KKT conditions for this formulation and embedded those conditions directly in the hybrid zonotope. And then you get a set that you can propagate without even having to solve the optimization. So you don't have to solve any optimization problems, but you can propagate reachable sets of MPC. If you want to plot it, then you have to solve optimization problems, right? So this is done implicitly. You get a representation of the set. And then if you want to plot it or maybe calculate a bound in a particular direction, right, then you're going to have to analyze the mixed integer representation. But what this provides is an alternate path to checking something like recursive feasibility of an MPC formulation. So instead of taking the formulation and then adding maybe a terminal set in order to get recursive feasibility, what you can do is basically just formulate the controller for performance and then run the reachability forward and see if it stays within the safe set you'd like, and then evaluate it that way. And you can go back and tweak and rerun the reachability if you need to. What about more general nonlinear systems? So hybrid zonotopes can approximate piecewise linear system, or can capture piecewise linear systems exactly, but we can approximate nonlinear systems in a sense arbitrarily closely. And so if you imagine something like a sine wave, what you can do is take a piecewise linear approximation of a sine wave. And in particular, we use something called a special ordered set representation, and that's this red line. And you can always add more line segments to get a tighter and tighter approximation of the continuous sine wave. And then once you have that, you just bloat it, right, with some thickness to make sure that you're encapsulating the original wave. So you get an over approximation of a nonlinearity. And doing this in one dimension is pretty easy, but when you have a higher dimensional system with a lot of nonlinearities, if you're going to do the sampling in every dimension, right, that complexity is not very favorable. So we wrote a lot of papers trying to understand how we can do this for higher dimensional nonlinear systems more scalably. It turns out the key is you basically decompose the system into a collection of 1D and 2D functions. You approximate those functions individually, and then you recompile them or recombine them. And if you do that correctly, you can propagate the approximation errors together. You can find some really nice tight approximations that don't have to be super complex, right? Here's an example we did of, this was basically intended as like a strength of signal measurement for a topology, right? And you can see we have the original curve, and then you have a hybrid isotope that bounds it. So to show that in action, we'll take a classical control systems example of an inverted pendulum. So what we did is we trained a neural network to mimic nonlinear MPC in stabilizing an inverted pendulum. We built that set mapping for the pendulum itself as a function of the control input. And then we took our trained neural network and we expressed that also as a hybrid isotope. Again, in this case, we used a ReLU neural network, and so we could represent the set-based mapping of the controller exactly. And then you can couple those two maps together into a map for the closed loop dynamics. And then you can do reachability of this closed loop system and see that the pendulum actually is nicely stabilized to the origin, right? And so this propagation in every time step takes about 5 milliseconds. But then again, if we want to analyze the set, we have to confront the mixed integer optimization. And so, for example, if I just want to bound it in a particular direction, right, solving that takes about 2 seconds. It turns out that this neural network stabilizing an inverted pendulum is actually a benchmark problem for this friendly competition in reachability analysis that folks do. So it's called the ARCH competition. And basically, it's a series of benchmark problems. And a bunch of folks all over the world get together every year. They try taking their tools and solving these benchmark problems, and then they write up a nice report that compares how they performed. So we solved that benchmark problem. And what we found that was interesting is if we use a really small initial set for the pendulum, then the other tools that solve this benchmark actually tend to do better than ours, right? So our proposed method for a small initial set took 312 seconds. Right? I should say all these numbers are seconds. But these other ones, right, some of them take half a second or less. But then if we make that set bigger, our approach still works, and the other ones all basically explode, right? And that's because they're just not able to get a tight enough approximation of the pendulum dynamics, right? Over a small initial set, that approximation holds up well enough. When you're trying to do reachability over a larger initial set, right, you hit the nonlinearities more severely, and you get this accumulated error through the reachability that has a tendency to explode. So what you can do with these other methods is you can take that large initial set, you could split it up into like hundreds of smaller sets and propagate all of those individually. But then you have to pick how much to split it up, and it's not really a clean solution. So we like that we're able to handle these larger initial sets directly. Another benchmark problem is this vertical collision avoidance system. So the idea of this is you have two aircraft flying towards each other. You're trying to make sure that when they get to the same vertical position, that they'll be horizontally separated by a certain distance. And in this case, there's a neural network that is helping to make the decision. So there's 9 neural networks, each of which has about 100 neurons, and those are providing a set of advisories. They're basically voting on advisories, and then one of those neural networks wins out. And then once the advisory is selected, then the pilot has a set of choices that they can make about how to fly the airplane, right? So this is a combination of neural networks and also some logic, right, and some uncertainty in which choice the pilot might make. And we are able to show in less than a second that, in fact, this system is unsafe, right? And it'll violate the requirement on the separation distance between the aircraft. And we do this again by building one of these set-based mappings that captures all these things. Because hybrid isotopes are nice and generalizable. We can capture the neural networks and the logic and the system dynamics, right, all within the same representation. The other tools that have tackled this problem don't have that same level of generality. And so they have to break the problem up into smaller pieces and handle them separately. So that was all offline verification. About a year ago, I started thinking about whether we might be able to use this online in some useful way. Right? So offline, you don't necessarily care how long it takes to compute things. As long as you can get an answer, that's fine. But online, the goal is to see if this can accelerate the speed of decision making or solve problems online that we wouldn't be able to solve otherwise. And we thought a little bit about what a good particular application to start with might be. And we settled on motion planning for autonomous vehicles. All right, so you think about a vehicle driving around, trying to avoid obstacles. Those obstacles are form a non-convex obstacle field, right? So other cars on the road, right, or some other obstacles on a map, that creates non-convexity. And we thought maybe we can represent these obstacle fields, right, either where the obstacles are or maybe the opposite, where the obstacles aren't. Maybe we can represent those as hybrid zonotopes and solve motion planning problems with that. And so that's what we wound up doing, right? So here we're showing, in this case, the free space where the vehicle is allowed to be is represented as a hybrid zonotope. And then we're solving a mixed integer model predictive control problem where the set of feasible states the vehicle is allowed to occupy are constrained to live on this hybrid zonotope. So let me walk you through this. So again, what we do is we find basically the free space where you're allowed to be. We represent that as a single hybrid zonotope. And then we wrote our own custom mixed integer program solver that exploits the structure of how this optimization problem looks when you use hybrid zonotopes. And so we've written a couple papers on there. One was in CDC late last year, and the other two are on arXiv if you want to check them out. When we do this, we represent the maps in two different ways. So one is just as a general polytope. And what we found is the way you construct the map really matters. So what we're doing in this case is we're using this existing algorithm to basically get the partition of the free space as polytopes, and then we construct those into a hybrid zonotope. And you can write down the complexity of that. You basically get one binary variable for every one of these convex regions in the map. And then you also get some continuous factors and constraints. Another really common map representation is occupancy grids. And so in this case, you just grid up the space, right? And any one of those grids that has anything in it, you say is a no-go zone, right? And then you're left with the grids you're allowed to be in. What's nice about this is that no matter how big the grid is, you always just have two continuous factors and one equality constraints. And then it's just the number of binary factors will change as you have more cells that you're allowed to be in. So we can represent these grids super efficiently as hybrid zonotopes. Now, what's, again, really nice about these hybrid zonotopes is that when you put them into mixed integer programs, the way that branch and bound works is it relaxes binary variables, right, and then solves quadratic programs subject to that relaxation. And when you do that relaxation, if you get a tight relaxation, then you get a nice bound in your quadratic program subproblem. But if you get a coarse relaxation, then you get a coarser bound, and it takes longer for the overall optimization algorithm to converge. So if we formulate these hybrid zonotopes intelligently, we get really nice bounds. And in fact, we get the tightest possible relaxed set, which is just the convex hull of the hybrid zonotope. All right, so for example, if you think of a set Z, which is this kind of lighter of the purple colors, right? When we formulate that as a hybrid zonotope, right, the way that we're doing it, there are multiple ways you could formulate it, but if you do it the right way, when you take the relaxation over the binary variables, you get the convex hull of that. If you use big M, which is a more conventional way of taking unions over convex sets, when you relax that, you get this massive red set, right? And that, again, leads to a much worse bound inside of the optimization algorithm. The other thing that's nice is when you do that relaxation, you take your hybrid zonotope and it becomes a constrained zonotope. And then constrained zonotopes, right? The inequality constraints are just boxes. And that winds up benefiting you when you get to these quadratic subproblems. Basically, instead of having to do matrix factorizations, you just have to, you get a diagonal matrix that you can easily invert. And so it makes the subproblems of the branch and bound algorithm go much faster as well. Then the other place where we found some computational benefits was in leveraging the context of this motion planning problem, right? So you have a binary variable associated with each of the free space regions that the vehicle is allowed to be in, and you can kind of limit the sequencing of when those binary variables are going to become active just by knowing the topology of the map. So if I know the speed of my vehicle, the maximum speed, then I know I'm not going to jump from being in a region that is really close to me to being one that's really far away from me, without having to take a couple time steps in between. And so we can constrain the branching just based on the region to region reachability of the vehicle. And this is not like a dynamic reachability like we were talking about earlier. Here, when I say reachability, I literally just mean bounding the vehicle speed and then looking at the shortest path, both from one region to the other and also from the vehicle to the different regions, right? So we use that basically within the heuristics of the branch and bound algorithm to get some further computational benefits. So I'll show you examples for 5 different maps, right? The one on the left is has some convex obstacles. Then the next one in has a non-convex obstacle. Then we have a grid that happens to spell PSU for Penn State. Then we have this one where we have hard obstacles, but we also have regions that you can be in, but at a different cost. And I'll talk about that more in a second. And then to show that we can do 3D, right, we have a 3D grid, right? And here we're showing an MPC algorithm planning for all of those. The vehicle is the kind of black dot that's moving, and then that trail of red circles is the prediction horizon. Yeah.
So maybe I'm make sure I understand. You're on the pre-processing and mapping out the hybrid zones beforehand, or
Yeah, so like solving for these things is pretty fast.
you're doing
I think that's a good question. I think it's so fast that it may not matter that much relative to how long it takes to solve the mixed integer program.
so you're not learning like where the obstacles are.
Oh yeah, so the sensing problem would be different, right? Like if we were trying to do SLAM, right, that would be a different task. So we're assuming we know the map.
You know,
Yeah.
you know that
Yeah.
before you start playing.
Sure. Yeah. I'll show you an example where that's only partially true in a second. So for these maps, basically, here's the computation times. So the top set of bars is average solution time. The lower set of bars is maximum solution time. This is implemented on a desktop computer with a 15-step horizon. And then kind of each set of bars going across is one of these different maps. So our methods are towards the left, with and without a warm start. And then on the right, we're using Garobi, which is a commercial solver that is free academically, but quite expensive if you have to buy a commercial license. And we are, in some cases, 100 times faster than Garobi, which was surprising to even us, right? Because Garobi is a really highly optimized commercial tool. And this tends to scale really well with the prediction horizon of the controller as well. So here we're just increasing the horizon from 5 to 10, then 15, then 20 steps. And you can see ours goes from below the rounding error, right? So the fastest one is 0.00 seconds. Obviously, it's not 0 time, it's just being rounded off. And then when you make the horizon 4 times longer, now it's 0.01, right? Whereas you can see that Garobi is increased by more than an order of magnitude. And I think, in fact, this one actually is just getting cut off because it's taking so long. Or maybe just the bar is getting cut off because it was out of the range. We wanted to see how this would work on embedded hardware. So we bought NVIDIA Jetson. So this is a pretty powerful embedded machine, but it fits on a robot. And in this case, we are just simulating the vehicle. So we're doing a process in the loop test, running a controller on the embedded machine, and then simulating it on a computer implemented in ROS. And this runs reliably at 5 Hertz. With our ROS2 implementation, our solver is in C++. And we get slightly different trajectories because we're basically capping, we're just getting the best solution we have after, a fifth of a second. But the differences are basically negligible. Like, this obstacle in the U, you go around it to the left or to the right, like actually doesn't matter, right? So it's not a big deal that we're terminating the optimization a little early in that case. I mentioned earlier that we can handle these cost constraints. So you could imagine maybe you're trying to avoid some adversary that has radars, and as those radars propagate through your field, they get kind of shadowed by some obstacles, and so you could map out regions that have different costs of being detected by an adversary. And one approach to solving this would be to just threshold, right? Regions that have above some cost, I'm just going to not go in those regions at all. But then you could wind up cutting off corridors completely, where now you can't get into your destination at all. And also, then you don't have that understanding of how spending maybe one time step in a high risk region would be different than spending more time steps in a lower risk region. So instead, we can just associate a cost with binary variables in that map being active, because each region has its own binary variable, right? So we can do that very easily, and then we can plan through these maps that have basically spatially varying costs of occupancy. We can also handle spatially varying disturbances, right? So here we added a wind associated with each region, and so the wind strength and direction can be different in each region. And then on the left, what you're seeing is what the planner does when there's no wind. In the middle is a case where there's kind of a tornado in the middle and the vehicle doesn't know about it. So it tries to go to the left and gets blown into the obstacle and crashes. And then on the right, we know about the tornado. We build that into our controller, and you can see it actually uses the wind direction to get to its destination. And then we also, so that covers, basically hybrid costs and hybrid disturbances. What about in the model itself? That's like the third piece of MPC is the model. So to handle that, we actually built a hybrid vehicle, and this connects nicely for me because I like energy systems. So here we have just a unicycle model of a vehicle. It turns out that model is differentially flat, and so we can still use a linear prediction model in the MPC, right, in the position states. And then we model the powertrain of this as just a very simple representation of a hybrid vehicle. So we have an engine and a battery, and you can pull power, from either, and you can use the engine to charge the battery and then driving a propeller. And then we coupled the motion states to the energy states. I know I'm going over this quickly, but the paper is out there if you want to see it, with kind of a conservative way of tying those together. And then we solved that as a planning problem where now we have obstacles in the map, which are the gray regions. But we also have in these kind of red regions, those are areas where you can go in them, but when you're there, the engine has to be off. And that would be a noise constraint, right? So you can go to these areas, but maybe there's people who live in those neighborhoods and they don't want to be hearing the engine of your UAV all the time. So when you're there, you got to run on battery power. And we can, again, just impose these as basically constraints within our mixed integer optimization. We can leverage all that same structure and do this planning. So you see here, like it basically pre-charges the battery, right? And then it uses the battery to get through this noise constrained region, and it's going off to the left because that's where there's the smallest noise restricted area. And then we can do these things in combination, right? So now we have noise restricted areas and we also have wind. And so we leverage this wind pattern to the right because now we can get through the noise restricted region even faster when we can take advantage of the wind. So we can add all these things together on top of each other, these different features, right? And here's a case where we are trying to reach a terminal set with some batteries. So this is showing we can do this energy constraints on the system and also have the cost regions, right? So you're trying to avoid these obstacles, but then the obstacles have some buffer around them so that you give them a wide berth if you can. You're trying to get to this terminal set with some minimum battery power left. And if you make the lower bound on the battery charge a little tighter, then you'll go a little closer to the obstacles. So you can weigh off terminal constraints with costs. So this is great as a motion planning level of a control framework, but that's typically not enough to do autonomy, right? In an autonomy stack, you need some kind of long-term path planner typically. I think of that as being like if I want to drive somewhere, I need Google Maps to tell me where I need to go in the long term, right? And then I need, my motion planning when I'm driving a car, that might be like me. And then I need low-level controllers under the hood, right? That are on board in my car. And so we built up a autonomy stack like this and put it on an actual robot, right? So some folks now are calling these layered control architectures, but they've been around for a long time. So here's that highest level controller. It's a graph search algorithm. It's a type of algorithm called a medial axis planner. So it's in some sense trying to go through the middle of corridors around obstacles. And so here we'll have blue obstacles that are known about. But then we'll also sprinkle in some red obstacles that are not known to the graph planner. And so as you get close to them, that's when you would detect them, maybe using some LiDAR or sonar, right? And so if one of those red obstacles happens to be in the way of your graph search plan, then locally your motion planner is going to have to find a way around it, right? And that's what I meant earlier when I said, like, there can be errors in the map. So we implemented this experimentally. There's a brand new building on Penn State's campus called eCore, and we have a motion capture testbed in there. So we've got a OptiTrack tracking system that we just got 2 months ago. So everything I'm showing is very new results, but it came together in, I thought, surprisingly fast. And then we're using a particular robot called a ROSbot. And so here's the setup. So this is basically the obstacles virtually overlaid over top of our robot. So again, blue obstacles are one that are known to the path planner. The red obstacles are not known to the path planner, and that's why it goes right through one of the red obstacles. So we kind of already know, like, we're going to have to deal with that in the motion planner when we get to it. And then this box here is basically the local map the motion planner sees, right? So it only sees the obstacles that are inside of this box. And the way it's staying on the long-term path plan is it's given a terminal set along the path that it has to reach by the end of its horizon. So we have a short NPC horizon that's trying to get to a point alongside of our longer term graph plan. And if I play this video, you can see it works pretty well, right? So we're generally tracking the graph plan, but kind of rounding the corners in it when there's no obstacles. And then the graph search algorithm, asks us to go through an obstacle. We see that it's there and find a nice way around it. Right? And you can see that the terminal point kind of moves fast or slow sometimes. We're still refining our heuristics for how we pick points along that path plan, but it works out. Now, what's neat is sometimes you reach points where they're just not passable. So here, the graph path planner wants to go down here, but this corridor is completely cut off by a red obstacle. There's just no way to get through there. And so what happens is that terminal set is going to become infeasible, right? We're going to find that we can't track the path plan. And that actually is good. That tells us that we need a different plan. And so when that becomes infeasible, we trigger the graph search algorithm to give us a different route that uses a different corridor. So you can see we get stuck behind this obstacle. And then bang, it triggered a new plan that used a different corridor. And then the vehicle turns around and it follows that plan instead. So we can actually use this to kind of detect local infeasibility of plans from the graph search algorithm. And again, you can see it does a nice job of routing around obstacles and kind of where the graph search algorithm, again, being a medial axis planner, is trying to go through the middle of corridors, but locally we know we can cut a little closer to objects. So I think I have really 2 more slides. So a good question to ask as a control engineer always is, when you have a cool method, can you solve the dual problem? So the dual problem of model predictive control, I consider to be moving horizon estimation. So we were able to do that. So in this case, we have an aircraft flying, and basically we're trying to estimate our position using the terrain below. So we can sense the height of the mountains underneath the airplane, and we're trying to localize based on that information. So we took some terrain data from around us in Pennsylvania. We made a hybrid zonotope approximation of that, which is on the bottom left. And then we put this into a mixed integer MPC problem using that hybrid zonotope to try to estimate position. We compared it to a particle filter with 10,000 particles, and we get about half of the RMS error. So it works pretty well. And right, it does way better than dead reckoning that doesn't really have any feedback at all. And then, it is a little bit of a faster, it's a little bit slower the first time step, right? But then once it gets warm started, the algorithm's much faster than real time. So a last slide just to wrap things up. So in terms of where we're going next, like I said, we've been doing this robot testing for about 2 months. A lot of you are far better roboticists than me, right? I come from an energy systems background, so I have a lot to learn there. but I think we're making some good progress. What we found is that we can exploit the structure of the hybrid isotope optimization online for these robot motion planning problems, but actually there's more general problems that we can still exploit structure for. And so we're working on developing that and hope to release some code that shows how we can solve more general classes of MPC problems by leveraging the structure of how they're formulated with constrained zonotopes and hybrid zonotopes. We're doing robust control co-design, right? A paper that we co-wrote with Mira and her students is live as of early this month. So you can see some hybrid zonotope-based control co-design papers. Again, solving dual problems in estimation, and then all the energy system stuff involving hybrid electric aircraft, starting to do that for aerial vehicles, but now also ground-based systems like microgrids, and even undersea systems. So nice broad set of literature. All right, so we are right at 4. Hopefully I haven't kept anyone late, but that is the talk.
All right, let's think.